some people need to be willing to die in order to liberate Palestine. And again, that is never the objective, but it is possibly a byproduct. It is possibly a consequence of the process of liberating Palestine. And when I say some people need to be willing to die, I mean not Palestinians for once. Palestinians can't so freely demonstrate solidarity and spirit in the same way. Of course they can't. Palestinian prisoners, if they did what we did, would probably be summarily executed or tortured. What we were trying to do was, of course, bring aid to Gaza, right? That's the principal objective of the mission. Of course it is. But anybody who thinks that the objectives begins and ends with that is completely naive.
Hello and welcome to Attrition. I'm your host, Ammar Kazmi, and in this show we delve into the forces of war, imperialism and Zionism, exploring their impact on our world and what it will take to overcome them. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Kieran Andrieu. Kieran is a British Palestinian political commentator and a regular contributor to Novara Media. He also holds a doctorate in political economy. Kieran recently joined the Global Sumud Flotilla in an attempt to break Israel's blockade of Gaza and to deliver vital humanitarian aid. He provided daily reporting from the flotilla. That was until he was kidnapped by the Zionist regime in international waters before he could complete his mission. And it's my pleasure to welcome him to the show today. So Kieran, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, and in such a homely environment as well.
Well, I'm glad the environment is homely, and I should also say welcome home. I know you've had a tough past few weeks, and that's obviously been very difficult for you and the other flotilla participants. I'm very grateful for you for being with me here today. I just want to start, before we talk about you being kidnapped and the abuse that you faced, with a broad overview of what happened, because you're at sea for over a month, because the vessels actually began to set sail at the end of August. And then there was this rendezvous in Tunisia before the mission continued. And of course, there were sabotage attempts with drones dropping incendiary devices onto some of the vessels. So there's a lot that happened, isn't there? Can you retrace what happened on the mission before you were kidnapped?
Well, it feels like another lifetime already. And we knew that that would be the case. Many times we discussed on the boat how we would reminisce about this and how it would kind of come to us. And our assumption seems to have proven correct already, which is that it would seem like it happened to other people. It didn't happen to us. Well, Barcelona to Tunisia. I think it became pretty obvious very early on in the mission that the organizing committee of the Global Sumud Flotilla had overshot, that they'd bitten off more than they could chew in terms of the logistical planning. Now, I'm just going to be completely honest about that, because I don't think there's any virtue in, varnishing the reality. I think that in a way, the point of telling you that is to emphasize something about the solidarity among the people on the boats and about the commitment to the objective at the heart of the mission, which is to get to Gaza. So the logistics, the capacity issues that the organizers had were palpable as soon as we left Barcelona. We left to great fanfare, and it was immensely moving. I saw people with tears strewn down their cheeks, waving us off. And it is, I think, hopefully the closest I'll ever get to feel like I'm being sent off to a war. And then we got on the boats, and then we had to do a sort of about face and dock in a harbour nearby, because we weren't ready, really, to set off. We just didn't want to muck up the fanfare, the optics, which I think I get, and I understand the need to do that, because so much was riding on this, and the Zionists were so ready to say that this was a failure, that it was destined for failure, that it was being rendered for the wrong motives and all the rest of it. But underneath all of that, we got through it because immediately people built ties of loyalty with one another on the boats, and because we never forgot the the impulse, the kind of the moral motivation underpinning all of this, which was we made a commitment to people who are being treated in a way that no human being should ever be treated, and have been treated all their lives in some degree or another in that way. And so any privations that we might feel we're suffering in our relatively privileged lives, any frustrations that we might feel with the organizing, with the lapsed scheduling, with the technical setbacks, the logistical setbacks, all of the smaller things like the seasickness and homesickness and all the rest of it, those things are minuscule and ephemeral. They're things that will pass very quickly. And once they've passed, the people in Gaza and in Palestine will still be living under Zionist occupation and all that that entails. And so, it almost sounds glib saying it, but we were utterly determined that whatever happened to us between Barcelona and Tunisia, and then in Tunisia and then beyond, would be only minor setbacks. They wouldn't stop the mission. They wouldn't convince or compel anybody to get off the boats or anything like that. So we set off from Barcelona. We encountered storms and we had to stop along the way, anchor outside Menorca. We saw a couple of drones. A couple of drones flew over my boat and a few others. And that was the first set of drone sightings. So, some people were blithe and some people were worried. But basically, nobody was saying, right, okay, well, we need to turn back or go off the mission. And then we got to Tunisia and we were greeted on the beaches as I suppose you would expect heroes to be greeted. And that didn't feel right to me, but it was still I took it to mean that there was a lot of solidarity for Palestine. I think that's the key thing, is rather than thinking this is all for me or for us, it's all for Palestine. It's all a manifestation, kind of collective embodiment of love for Palestine. And we were merely vectors for that love, bringing it to Palestine. That's how I tried to see all of that all the way through from Barcelona to close to the shores of Gaza. And so we got to the port of Sidi Bou Said in Tunis, and there that manifestation of love for Palestine was on the beaches waiting for us. And it was immense and vast and beautiful. Flares set off as we approached the beach. Children swimming in the waters as we approached in our boats. Not the safest thing in the world. Health and safety standards slightly different in Tunisia, but it was very moving. And then we docked for a couple of days because, as I say, the organisers, bless them, their hearts were in the right places, but they bit off more than they could chew. And so we had to dock for a couple of days. A technical stop was the comms, was the spin. But it was true. I mean, it was a technical stop. And then I go to my hotel and then I hear, just as I'm about to go to sleep, I think on the second night, that our boat, my boat in particular, Family, it was called, had been drone bombed, or an explosive had been dropped from a drone. So I go down there and, it's pandemonium down at Sidi Bou Said, and I can see our boat and the fire's been put out. We know that everybody's safe and we're getting footage. We're, receiving footage from one of my boatmates, Yusuf Omar, who filmed extensively and was actually on the boat when it happened. He filmed he in the end didn't complete the trip, but he filmed while he was on the boat very often. And that was that. What can you say? The BBC reported that it was a cigarette. And then 2-3 weeks later, Netanyahu admits that it was an Israeli incendiary device dropped from an Israeli drone, either via a proxy or directly via an Israeli drone. I don't know. But Netanyahu took responsibility for it, proudly, of course, boasted about doing it in Tunisian waters. I still haven't seen an apology from the BBC or a correction that they said that it was a cigarette, some cigarette. But anyway, that was that. And then we're there for a few days, and genuinely the mission could have fallen apart at that point. The following night, Ammar, the second largest boat, actually the largest boat, but the second boat of the mission, is bombed again with an incendiary device dropped from a drone. And the mission really could have ended there and then.
But what sort of damage did that actually cause? Was it more just a fear-inducing tactic, or did it actually cause any substantial damage?
This is a really important point. It was a fear-inducing tactic, and it was a deterrent. And obviously they underestimated the people on the flotilla because nobody was deterred. But no, and I'm glad you asked me that, because this is a theme that runs through everything. The Israelis clearly were frightened to kill anybody. They clearly were frightened to physically injure, seriously injure anybody. They could have killed us easily. And later there were another set of drone attacks just south of Crete in international waters, but we could see the island of Crete from our boat. And, you know, obviously completely illegal on so many levels. But again, they could have killed us, and they didn't. What they did was take out a couple of our boats, take out masts, drop incendiary devices away from people and targeting parts of the boat that were sparsely populated or empty. And that seems to have been a method that was, or tactic that was consistent throughout the whole process. So it was pure intimidation. It was an attempt to deter people from getting there. And it worked in the sense that people, you know, we soul searched about what was going to happen to us. You know, are we going to be murdered when we get there? Are we going to be blown up? Rumors were circulating all the time. We're going to be sunk. You know, the boats, they're going to sink one boat to make an example. They might rescue the people on it, but they're going to sink the boat. And then, you know, they're not going to rescue the people on it. They're going to sink one boat to make an example, and that hope that the rest of us turn back. They're going to blah, blah, on, you know. And that was, I think, the purpose of the drones, was to basically, they didn't want to have to deal with us. They knew that they couldn't kill us in the way that they feel they can kill Palestinians, like the rest of us brush our teeth in the morning. So they didn't want to have to process us. They didn't want to have to deal with the bureaucracy as much as anything else. They didn't want to have to expend the resources. And so what they were interested in doing was precluding our passage into their, as they regard it, their waters, or yeah. So they wanted to basically stop us from getting there. And they thought that by drone bombing the boats, they would be able to achieve that. They, as I say, underestimated everybody.
Mm. You spoke earlier in your answer about the overwhelming support that you received from people, but there was very limited support from states for this mission, even when it comes to upholding something very basic that all states ought to be interested in, which is the freedom of navigation in international waters. There was some limited help from Italy and Spain in terms of deploying escort vessels, but they obviously didn't go with you all the way. Although if they had done, that obviously would have brought things to a head in quite a direct and interesting way. Were you hoping for more international assistance, and did you expect that there would be more of an outcry for states to support the flotilla?
Honestly, no. I knew we were going to be going it alone. And actually, I say I knew, I was wrong, because in the end, the blessed people of Italy and Spain put so much pressure on their governments. I mean, it's wrong. It's a category error to say Spain and Italy, the Spanish and Italian governments are the same. They're not. I mean, they're both NATO, you know, quasi-imperialist countries. Of course they are. But they produce, you know, different kind of ideological flavors of government at this moment in time. We have a Spanish government that's left of center, and we have an Italian government that's neo-fascist, right? But the thing that brought them together on this occasion was the strength of feeling among the general public and in Spanish and Italian civil society, respectively, for the protection of people on the flotilla, and by extension, I mean, that wouldn't exist in isolation. It couldn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in relation to the love that the general publics of those countries tend to have for Palestine, and the enmity that they tend to have for Zionist Israeli aggression against Palestine and Palestinians. So I didn't expect naval frigates from Italy, and I didn't expect naval vessels from Spain to be joining us on the Mediterranean. I really didn't. And you don't have to praise or love the Meloni government or the Spanish government to say that changed things. That changed the calculus of risk to us on the flotilla. It changed the threat level. And it also means something in the broader kind of international relations dynamics. And I think we ought to, the left sometimes feels squeamish about international relations wins because they come around so rarely for us. International relations is such a inherently reactionary space and environment because the state system is inherently reactionary. And I think that the fact that we were able to draw navies out onto the Mediterranean by linking up with our brothers and sisters in those countries, and by having them amplify the message, and by having them close down entire parts of the economy, of their respective economies, and by having trade unions play such a central role in all of that, and by all of that then filtering up into government and government decision making, and then by extension to the military and military decision making. It was a clear example that the chain of command seems like it's totally isolated from the public and public opinion, but actually, no, it begins and ends with the general public.
You mentioned that it was the peoples of Spain and Italy who pressured their governments. Perhaps more pressure was applied in Italy than in Spain. But there were some states, or many states, that didn't provide any material assistance, like Britain, obviously. And I have to say, there wasn't a clamour in Britain for the British government to support you. So is that not also a major problem, that it wasn't possible to build that groundswell of support in most countries to make the flotilla more effective? Were you surprised by that? And what do you think was behind that inaction?
First of all, no, I'm not surprised that didn't happen, and I didn't expect it. I think that we have to disentangle things a little bit here. So in Britain, you have the largest pro-Palestine demonstrations, which suggests that we have a huge groundswell of not just general public support, but also of active kind of pro-Palestine infrastructure, which has been built up probably since the war in Iraq, actually. And a lot of it's transferable when, you look at the organizations, Stop the War, PSC, and so on. There's been a lot of resource and knowledge sharing between those kind of two cohorts, and they've merged over time, and that's a good thing. So why then do we not get the kind of mass civil disobedience or threats of civil disobedience that we see in Italy and in Spain translating into government, material government support for the flotilla protection? Even though you could argue Meloni's government is more right-wing than Keir Starmer's, although that's another debate we could have. I think for analytic purposes, it is more right-wing than Keir Starmer's, although Keir Starmer's government is obviously very right-wing in lots of ways. So how do we solve that puzzle? Why has that happened? Well, then I think we have to look beyond kind of individual agents and the centrality of kind of civil society infrastructure. You have to look to, sorry to get really technical about it, but you have to look at the way in which Italian civil society and Spanish civil society is plugged into trade unions and the structure of the economy. And I think that's where the answer lies. If Italian workers had been neutered in the same way, and labour movements had been neutered in the same way that they had been in the United Kingdom, we wouldn't have seen those naval frigates coming out in the Mediterranean, to put it very bluntly. So things that happened 20, 30, 15 years in the past have a very real impact today in that sense. And I think ultimately it's the structure of the relations between labour and capital and the government, the state, what used to be called consociational relations. It's that kind of industrial relationship and the proximity of those actors in Italy and in Spain that produces the impacts that we see resulting in this particular scenario in naval frigates arriving on the Mediterranean, or naval vessels arriving on the Mediterranean to protect us. Now, I know that's quite a convoluted thing to say, but I really think that's the key. I think that that's how you solve the conundrum. And so I suppose what that means is for the British left, we need to navigate that. We need to find ways to shut down our economy. The phrase in Italy, we made a video about it on the boat, was blocchiamo tutto. Apologies to our Italian cousins for my pronunciation, but the blocchiamo tutto, I think it means, block everything.
Block everything.
Block everything, right? And of course, that was the message that was going through to the Meloni government. We will block everything. We will shut down the economy if you don't protect our brothers and sisters on the flotilla, and by extension, our brothers and sisters in Gaza for whom they are sailing. If you say blocchiamo tutto in England, it's a totally defanged threat, because you can't block everything because of the nature of the retrenchment of union power in this country over the past 30, 40 years. And so I think that's the key to understanding it. But that's not a counsel of despair. It's not hopeless. What I'm saying is, look, we have the raw materials in the UK. Industrial relations have been reconfigured such deliberately that those raw materials don't translate into the kinds of, impacts that we see in Italy and in Spain, or the kind of impact that we would hope for. It's on us to try and translate that kind of civil society infrastructure that we've built up very carefully, and translate the raw materials and the raw power that we have in the numbers of people that show up for Palestine. It's on us to try and reorganize society in such a way that that then has the impacts that we see in Italy and in Spain.
I just want to turn now to the beginning of October this year, when you were kidnapped from your sailing boat alongside others, and other vessels were also targeted in that same way. How did that unfold, and where were you taken?
So we were about 70 nautical miles from the coast of Gaza. For those who don't know, I didn't know until I went on the boat. 12 nautical miles counts as territorial waters. So you can see from that disparity how far into international waters Israel is willing to enact its piracy. So we were kidnapped at 70 nautical miles. They kind of menaced us for a couple of nights before that with bright lights and silhouetted vessels somewhere on the horizon around us. They would move about, kind of almost like, I mean, this is quite an impressionistic thing to say, but for a couple of nights in the dark, you could see these things moving around, silhouettes against the starry sky, and it almost felt like when you're watching an old Disney film or something, and you hear the menacing music, the menacing music kick in, and then they would disappear, and then we would, wake up, and another night passed, and we were that much closer to Gaza, and you would start to maybe have a bit of false hope that we were going to make it. And then suddenly, we were told that our radars were picking up that there were several 10 to 12 vessels approaching very fast from the port of Ashdod. And then half an hour later, lo and behold, they were there, and it all happened very quickly. I was live streaming on Instagram, and then they were just there. They were just, I could see all their faces. They were that close, and they were saying to us, we're going to board your vessel. It's for your own good. you're about to enter an active war zone. You're about to breach a blockade. We're here to protect you. If you comply, no one will get hurt. All this kind of stuff. And then they do you understand? Put your hands up. Point your hands very directly in the air if you understand. And then they climb on board. And then they stand there for a while. One of them said, I'll never forget this. One of them said, after a while, he smiled. Well, I mean, they all had masks on, but you could tell from his eyes that he was smiling. And he said, you know, we're the good guys, right?
Wow.
It was, I mean, it felt cinematic. I hope that doesn't sound too frivolous to say so. But, you know, when something like that so out of the ordinary happens, and you've imagined it so many times, you've anticipated it for so long, you've run through every single scenario of how it might happen using your imagination as a tool. Of course, it does feel cinematic. So yeah, he said that. And at the time, I thought, oh, well, of course, he's talking about the IDF in relation to Palestinians or Palestine, or maybe in their minds, Hamas. Later, it kind of occurred to me that actually maybe he meant in relation to the Israeli police, because the interception was soft. You know, soft. I mean, it's still totally illegal. They had zero jurisdiction to be there. So I don't want to start to kind of, you know, give them more room with our language. This is the S-13 unit, which is absolutely central and instrumental to and in the genocide. I mean, they've killed children, these guys. And I did whisper to somebody I was sitting next to. I was sitting next to the Portuguese socialist MP, Mariana Mortágua, and I said to her very quietly, because I didn't want to get us killed, I said, how does it feel to be looking at the worst people in the world? And she sort of smirked, and that was that. But it was, yeah, the interception was soft in the sense that there was no violence towards us. Then when we got to Ashdod, the police were very aggressive, and they clearly had been given a mandate to be aggressive. So clearly what had happened was the Israeli government had said to the IDF, you be good cop, and the cops will be bad cop, right? So it occurred to me later, maybe when he said, you know, we're the good guys, right? He wasn't talking about Palestinians or Palestine or whatever. He was talking about the IDF in relation to the cops. So, and then we were transferred to a prison in the Negev desert. And Ben-Gvir was sort of made an appearance and was trying to intimidate us. What was really heartening, and I want to emphasize this, was that actually, although we were intimidated and people were, I think, and are traumatized by what happened, we never jettisoned our principles. You know, we carried on shouting Free Palestine in front of the prison guards, in front of Ben-Gvir. We carried on refusing to comply with their demands of silence or whatever. We continued to show solidarity and spirit. And I think that is something that I'll never forget. I mean, again, it's important to caveat all of this with an understanding of our privilege. You know, Palestinians can't so freely demonstrate solidarity and spirit in the same way. Of course they can't. Palestinian prisoners, if they did what we did, would probably be summarily executed or tortured. So, you know, I don't want to get carried away and say, oh, it was so amazing that we were able to show so much spirit. I mean, it was great, but we were able to do that because we have Western European, in many cases, or North American passports. We were able to do that because in many cases, those guys, you know, we had white skin or European names. So my dad's Palestinian, but I've got a British passport. I sound British. I was born and raised in England, and I have a European name because I took my mother's name. I wasn't raised with my dad in the household. So it's a different game, obviously. Nonetheless, it still felt like a powerful and important arc,
you made reference to your Palestinian heritage, and of course, your younger brother Ahmed has spent many years in Zionist jails for the crime of being a Palestinian who resists the occupation of his homeland. And you've also mentioned elsewhere that you were taken to the same jail that he has also spent time in, and that was obviously some years ago that he had been there. You and the other people on the flotilla were able to experience a fraction of the torture that Ahmed has faced and that many other Palestinian political prisoners and hostages continue to face. These jails are designed to torture and break the human spirit, and Palestinians who leave those jails are always visually changed and often psychologically disturbed and transformed. Talk a bit about these Zionist dungeons and what they do to Palestinians.
So it's a prisoner industrial complex, and the profiteering, and I think it's important to link it to the capitalist process. The profiteering doesn't come primarily from production. In other words, it's not free labor that Israel's interested in, really. I mean, Palestinians do perform free labor in those places sometimes, but that's not really where value is extracted. Value is extracted from the exchange of contracts. You know, Israel has a vast array of high-tech security that it sells to itself and to tests and develops and then sells elsewhere in the world. And it tests these primarily on Palestinians. And it develops those with Palestinians as its prisoner or political subjects. And it creates a great deal of value for itself by having these internment camps, this archipelago of internment camps and torture chambers and so on. So that's the first thing to understand. The second thing to understand, of course, is that it's dealing with as it regards a surplus population, a population that it doesn't want to have to deal with, that it wants to dispose of. And so my brother is the example of somebody who wouldn't deal with his subordination very well in the eyes, through the prism of Israeli colonization. They would regard him as somebody who didn't want to be subordinate, pliant, and then eventually face extermination in one form or another. So from a very young age, he was very active politically. And I think there's a generational shift thing here to point out or to emphasize, which is that my dad's generation were very political. My dad actually wasn't that political, but his generation, his brothers, his siblings, were very political. They were part of the PFLP, they were part of other political organizations. My own uncle was murdered by Mossad in the late 1970s. I never got to meet him, of course, long before I was born. My generation, I think, is less political, I'm sorry to say. And that is the outcome of intergenerational and consistent and repeated attempts by the state of Israel to break the back of Palestinian resistance. But my brother was an outlier. My brother Ahmed was an outlier. I have two brothers. One of them hasn't followed the same path as Ahmed. And I have to say, though I'm very proud of Ahmed for not submitting and not being subordinated by Israel, as an older brother, I am also relieved that my other brother, in some sense, keeps his head down. It's a terrible thing to say. It's a terrible thing to say because I would love for us to be, all of us to be vibrant rebels in the face of Israeli occupation and Zionist oppression. But as an older brother, I have to say I am also relieved. So Ahmed, from a very young age, was very political. He was an outlier, as I say, and more like our dad's generation of activists. And he found himself marked out very, very early on as a result. And then he was kind of swallowed up into the Israeli prisoner industrial complex at the age of 12. And he was chewed up and spat out. And then he was sucked back in, chewed up again, spat out. Rinse, repeat for the past 20 odd years. And he has very, very bad mental health as a result, as you would expect. I mean, very bad to the point where it's very difficult to communicate with him for anybody, including my dad and my own family members. So he's just one example of what Israel does to Palestinian youth if it doesn't comply. And he's one example of what Israel does to Palestinians generally if they don't agree to lead a totally supine life as functionaries of Israeli superiority and functionaries of Israeli hierarchy. It's a terrifying thing. It's a terrifying thing. And when you see those prisons, so when I got to Ketziot, let me describe Ketziot to you quickly, which is the prison in the Negev desert where my brother, as you say, had been tortured many years earlier, and which I had the misfortune of ending up in. Can I say this? I think I will. Like many things in Israel, it's kind of done on the cheap. Corrugated iron roofs. It feels makeshift. And indeed, it is makeshift. It's just something that they built in the middle of the desert to torture people and to deal with their surplus Palestinian population problem. You really get the sense of the gimcrack when you're there. It really feels like it's all been done on the cheap. And I think most Israeli prisons are that way. The prison guards are, as you would expect Israeli prison guards to be, violent, aggressive, trained to torture, trained in many cases to rape. I don't want to be kind of overly impressionistic about things, but you can see that in their faces. You can see that in the way that they interact with people. Even us. I mean, they obviously had been drilled within an inch of their lives not to lay a hand on us, really, although they were aggressive. They did grab people. They did throw us onto the floor and so on, kick us and so on. But not in the way that they're used to being able to deal with Palestinians. But you could see that they were champing at the bit. They really wanted to break our teeth. They really wanted to break our fingers. They really wanted to show us what they're capable of. But they had obviously been told that they're not allowed to on this occasion. Most of our human rights were violated in the form of refusing to give us water, refusing to give us our medicine. And I'm talking about old people who have underlying heart conditions and very serious need for medicine, critical medicine. But there weren't the kinds of physical assaults that Palestinians are accustomed to when inside Israeli prisons.
Well, just before we move on, I want to pick up on one thing which you mentioned, which is your relief that your other brother hadn't taken the same route as your brother Ahmed. And I think it's very important to stress, and I always do, that Palestinians shouldn't be idealized and stylized as, rebels in the anti-colonial struggle. Palestinians are human beings, just like everyone else. They have families, dreams, ambitions, and Palestinians didn't choose to be colonized. They were colonized by a violent ethno-supremacist movement, and that's not their fault. And those who've chosen to resist were forced into that position, but that's not everyone's duty or everyone's role. And it's, entirely human for you to be glad that a member of your family is not in that very brave, but also extremely difficult position like your brother Ahmed is. Before we move on from discussing the flotilla, I just want to raise with you some criticisms that I've seen leveled at the flotilla mission, not from a logistical perspective, but from a political and strategic perspective, and obviously from a pro-Palestine perspective, because, I don't care what the Zionists have to say about the flotilla. But some people on our side have talked about the scale of the costs involved and whether those could be better spent elsewhere. And in terms of strategy, it's been suggested that the flotilla might have been more useful, targeting somewhere, for example, like RAF ATTRITION on Cyprus, the British airbase that's been used to help conduct the genocide. and, perhaps more directly targeting Western countries that are actively complicit and involved in the genocide, rather than essentially, giving yourselves up to the Zionist regime to be kidnapped, tortured, and eventually deported. Obviously, there's a lot of good that can be said about the flotilla, and your experience is, of course, very, very important. So I'm interested in what your response is to these criticisms. I mean, would you say that there could or that there should be a change of strategy for any future mission?
I don't think that a flotilla should have a monopoly on strategic energy within the pro-Palestine movement. I definitely agree with that. I think, it needs to be scrutinized as a financial prospect as much as anything else, because those are resources that could go elsewhere into the pro-Palestine movement in all of its various forms and in all of its countries. So I am very, very receptive to that criticism, or that question, at least. I think that the flotilla I was part of was something that I can at least justify to myself strategically. I think that it came at the right time. I think that trying a civilian humanitarian mission on that scale was the next logical step after the Madeleine and after the Handler, which were the two individual boats. Now, of course, there have been many flotillas before that. But I think, it had kind of been in the zeitgeist for a while, hadn't it? After Israel intercepted the Madeleine, after Israel intercepted the Handler, people were saying, 1,000 boats now, a flotilla, 1,000 strong, 1,000 Madeleines, all of that kind of stuff. It was, maybe I'm just locked in an echo chamber, but it seemed that was the pro-Palestine discourse was awash with that. And so I think actually it needed to happen. What we were trying to do was, of course, bring aid to Gaza, right? That's the principal objective of the mission. Of course it is. But anybody who thinks that the objectives begins and ends with that is completely naive. We knew that there was, empirically speaking, a very good chance that we were going to be intercepted. Of course, I used this analogy before, and to anybody who's heard me use it, I'm sorry if it's trite by now, but when Shrewsbury Town get drawn against Manchester City in the FA Cup, they don't say, well, we're going to probably lose. We're going to go out there. We're almost certainly going to get smashed statistically. No, they say we're going to go out there and we're going to put our best foot forward and we're going to play to the death and we're going to try and win. And that's what we were doing with the aid. We wanted to get it to Gaza above all else. To hell with the recent past, to hell with empirics. We were going to get it there. That was our intention. You play to win, and that's what we were trying to do, was to get aid to Gaza. Nonetheless, you have to have contingency strategy or contingency tactics. Why were we doing it beyond aid? We were putting our bodies on the front line, first of all, as a statement of solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Gaza, who have no choice but to put their bodies on the front line every single day. So it was a statement of solidarity with them. We know we're in a different position to you. We know we have more protection. We're privileged, but we are going to do everything we can to put our bodies on the front line as close to you as we can, as close as Israel will let us get. And then second of all, we are going to use ourselves as pawns in a game of international relations chess, or whatever, however you want to construe it. We are going to put ourselves on the Mediterranean as pawns in an attempt to force other countries to acknowledge that sometimes they can't choose to side with Israel. Sometimes they have to be drawn into a conflict with Israel, not a physical conflict necessarily, but a political conflict. And we're going to make things difficult. We're going to make things hot under the collar for Israel, at the least. We're going to drain a few of Israel's resources, at the least. And I'm told, and I don't know if this happened or not, I still haven't verified it independently, but I'm told that people in Gaza were able to, some people were able to fish. And the fact that people were able to eat the fish in their own waters that belongs to them, that is denied them by a Zionist genocidal entity that shoots them or bombs them if they try to go to their own waters. The fact that for 1 or 2 nights they were able to eat that fish because we drained their resources, that for me is A, immensely moving, and also shows that it has value in and of itself. Is a forever flotilla strategy legitimate? No. Are there other things that we can spend the money on now? Yes, absolutely. But does that mean that the flotilla I was part of was that there is a strategic, legitimate basis for it? Yes, I think there was. And I think that I can defend that. But that doesn't, as I say, that does not mean that a forever flotilla strategy is in itself justified.
I think one thing that the flotilla demonstrated is that there's been a groundswell of people who are fed up with symbolic actions like protesting. And I don't want to discount, the place that protesting has. I've been on protests, but it has a role and a small role. And I think, frankly, we're beyond that now, aren't we? I mean, people want to take material action to stop the Zionist regime and to materially assist the people of Palestine in the worst part of their history. And out of that yearning, we've seen people take direct action against arms factories like Elbit Systems, and we've seen this flotilla. And, that's not a be-all and end-all, but it has a place in the broad range of action that must be taken. And that leads me to think and talk about the motivation behind taking direct action. Because while Palestinians are mostly Muslim and Palestine is important in Islam, it has the third holiest Islamic site, it's the land of the prophets of God, many Muslims have been inactive when it comes to supporting Palestine. Obviously, there's the Palestinian resistance and there's the Islamic resistance movements more broadly in Lebanon, Yemen, Iran, and so on. And there are the peoples of many Islamic countries who have been demonstrating and have been clamoring for, Palestine to be supported. So I'm not talking about all Muslims, but clearly lots of Muslims, despite having a theological obligation and command to assist the people of Gaza, have been shamed by the many non-Muslims who have in fact stepped up, sacrificed, put their freedom and lives at risk through taking direct action. I often say that those people are more Muslim than the people who call themselves Muslim. So I'm interested to know about your motivations for going on the flotilla in full knowledge of the sacrifice that could entail.
Well, so first of all, one of the great ills, underappreciated ills or ill consequences of consumer capitalism in the 21st century is that it creates huge risk aversion among consumers. As much as anything else, consumer capitalism has created an empire of comfort. People are just very, very risk averse. Now, I don't mind comfort. I don't mind people enjoying the comfort of home and the comfort of their gizmos, if that's what, gives them pleasure and meaning. But I think that it does pose a serious problem for revolutionism, for anti-imperialist struggle, for people who seriously want to, might in other times have been willing to sacrifice things. As long as there are people suffering as much as people in Gaza are suffering, and then you have this empire of comfort everywhere else, you are going to have a serious set of challenges to navigate, to try and organize in a way that's commensurate to the challenge of liberation in places like Gaza and so on. Because of that enormous risk aversion and the risk averse society that's been created by consumer capitalism. No revolutions ever happened. No forceful liberation, and more or less every liberation has to be forcefully rendered. More or less every kind of revolution or forceful liberation of a people has not occurred without some death. We had to be prepared to die on the mission. We had to be safe in the knowledge that we probably wouldn't die, but that there was a chance that we would, maybe 10%, maybe 15%, maybe less, maybe slightly more. And it changed at given times. And if we were properly primed, we had to be aware that that was the case. And we had to be willing to walk through it nonetheless and do it nonetheless. And I would argue that though death should never be, I mean, I'm not kamikaze about these things. And I am certainly not, in some sort of way religious about it, mortify the flesh and reject the material world and flagellate and all of that. I don't think that helps Palestinians at all. It doesn't help Palestine. I want as many Palestine activists to be alive and well and able to carry on until they're 95 with their Palestine activism. So I don't in any way subscribe to this sort of self-flagellating people need to show their sacrifice for Gaza by dying or being tortured themselves. Reject that entirely. However, purely strategically, and I don't want to sound cold about it, because I don't think I'm a cold person generally, but some people need to be willing to die in order to liberate Palestine. And again, that is never the objective, but it is possibly a byproduct. It is possibly a consequence of the process of liberating Palestine. And when I say some people need to be willing to die, I mean not Palestinians for once. And so I was willing to do that. I didn't want it to happen. I love my life. As I say, I think it benefits the world for Palestine as much as anything else that there are people who are pro-Palestine that are alive rather than dead. I don't think martyrdom, as I say, should be the goal, but there has to be that strategic calculus made, and people need to be willing to do that. So that's the first thing. And of course, a risk-averse society, I'm starting to sound like a self-help book or something with that, but a risk-averse society isn't conducive to that, to producing the people who are willing to sacrifice themselves if absolutely necessary. That's the first thing. The second thing is your point about religion. I don't want to be overly provocative. Half of my family is Muslim. My dad's family is Palestinian Muslim, and some of them practice more piously than others, but they are all Muslim and they would all consider themselves Muslim. In a way, I think it proves, it's not proof, but it's evidence of the skepticism that I have, that people who do not have a God are able to be motivated by humanism and by their humanity to do things which, in your own reckoning, in your own words, hasn't sufficiently animated people who have God. And in this case, the God shared by the majority of our brothers and sisters in Palestine. So I just leave that hanging. I'll put that back to you.
I don't agree with everything that you say, but I certainly don't blame any non-Muslim for being skeptical about the sincerity of some people's Islamic beliefs when they've seen what they've seen. I mean, I think in reality, when we think about religion and its adherents, we can't think of them as monoliths. I mean, I personally find it hard to accept that I follow the same religion as many of those who call themselves Muslims. And for all intents and purposes, we aren't really following the same religion. I mean, in my theology, separation from worldly gain and having to sacrifice in support of the oppressed is absolutely baked in. It's a fundamental part of what I believe. But for the commercialized Islam of many of the Persian Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, it isn't. Do we really follow the same religion? Does the resistance in Palestine, Yemen, Lebanon, and so on have anything truly in common with the Muslims of other parts of the world who side with imperialism? I don't think so. The Islam that's followed in some of the Persian Gulf countries and also across the world is about keeping people anti-political and docile. It's not true Islam. And those people aren't willing to sacrifice because they're attached to the pleasures of this world. Meanwhile, there are many non-Muslims who, if they don't believe in an afterlife, have everything to lose, their whole world, when they put their lives on the line. A Muslim who puts their life on the line believes in martyrdom, believes that they'll be elevated, their soul will be elevated, that they will go to paradise, that they'll be rewarded. A non-Muslim doesn't believe that. I don't think that denigrates the religion itself, because the Quran talks about the fact that the people who really follow Islam are kind of few in number, who really follow the way of God are few in number. Most people always reject the truth. But I think it does say something about the fact that there are a minority of people, Muslim and non-Muslim, who have shared instincts that transcend religious lines. And those instincts are about having that common bond in fighting against oppression and having that visceral antagonism towards the forces of oppression in this world.
But surely the common denominator between a religious person motivated to act and the secular person motivated to act is humanity, is common humanity, is whatever it is, but that impulse and instinct toward empathy and solidarity and love for other people, even total strangers. As you say, is a lot of these people are secular people who have maybe never met a Palestinian in their lives, or maybe they've met a couple of Palestinians in their community, but they've never been to Palestine. And yet they were motivated to potentially sacrifice their lives because they are so disgusted at the destruction of human life, the destruction of the lives of strangers. And so we ought to heed the fact that that is the common denominator.
I agree, and I think that someone in an Islamic resistance movement who's putting their life on the line for the liberation of their homeland and to be free has more in common with a non-Muslim who's taking direct action against the Zionists than with someone who calls himself a Muslim but doesn't act in that way.
Just to say finally on the point about secularism and religion, and I obviously I'm sensitive to the fact that religion forms such an important part of the basis of solidarity for so many dispossessed peoples, and it has functioned that way in lots of human history. I totally get that, and I want to respect that. I mean, I'm not, the whole kind of four horsemen, the Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harriott, all those appalling people who came to the conclusion that religion was absolutely the worst thing. It's so obvious that to me anyway, that the sort of civilizational systematic capitalism is the target. It's the thing that you ought to be trying to tackle if you really want to think about imperialism, injustice, huge disparities in material wealth, and all of the privations that causes. You don't, and if you really want to grasp the nettle, that's what you have to go after.
Well, exactly. And I also think that those people have shown themselves up as not being opposed to religion per se, but just being opposed to Muslims and Islam. I mean, Richard Dawkins says that he's culturally Christian. People like Sam Harris have basically nothing to say against Judaism. And in fact, they support the ethno and Jewish supremacist ideology of Zionism. So Islamophobia, I think, motivates much of that. But thankfully, in 2025, we've disposed of the new atheist movement. Let's just turn now to the ceasefire. So a ceasefire was recently announced in Gaza, although that continues to be violated by the Zionists, and we know that they continuously break ceasefires. But in the immediate period, there's a pause in the full-scale genocide. And with that pause, there's a danger, potentially, that calls for accountability will slow down. We already saw Donald Trump speaking triumphantly alongside Zionist war criminals in the Knesset, and we saw many world leaders lining up to congratulate Donald Trump for being a supposed peacemaker. That doesn't bode well for trying to hold these politicians accountable, does it?
All right, so you're right. I agree with you. It doesn't bode well. But look, I think we're looking at it from the wrong way around, right? We're looking through the wrong end of the telescope, if you like. What we need to be focusing on is how to liberate Palestine, first and foremost, and contingent on that, or heavily contingent on that, or adjacent to that, how we precipitate the conditions for the decline and fall of Zionist Israel. Now, if people watching this, before they lose their minds, all I mean is Israel as it's presently constituted, which is to say an apartheid, racist, ethno-supremacist, genocidal state. So that such a state does not have the right to exist, and such a state should not exist. I don't think Israel can exist as it does for very long. And that is where most of my hope comes from. That's where I derive most of my hope from, actually. I think Israeli statecraft, obviously with the backing and underwriting of the United States over the past 40, 50, 60 years, has been so effective at neutralizing previously inimical neighbors, so neighboring states, neutering Egypt, Jordan, Syria, etc., etc. It's been so successful at destroying every last political and civil society outpost of Palestinian society. It's been so successful at creating that prisoner industrial complex that we talked about earlier. In other words, it's just been very, very successful because of its support from the United States. It couldn't have done it on its own. Obviously, it couldn't have done it on its own. It would have just collapsed in the 1960s. It's been so successful, in other words, at locking down every single aspect of its genocidal, ethno-cleansing apartheid program that there is no hope left, for me at least, in terms of spontaneous Palestinian resistance from within. What we do have is some things that I think will really, really start to bear significant fruit in the coming decades, in the coming years. And of course, that will be too late for many Palestinians, but it won't be too late for Palestinians in total and Palestine. So what are those things? First of all, Israeli internal antagonism. I think Israel is utterly riven by deep internal contradictions, which it cannot reconcile in the long term, which will eventually, I don't know when, I don't want to put a date on it, leads to the collapse of the state of Israel. So what's our job? What's our task? And I'll come round to your specific question about accountability, the tail end of that. Our task then is to do everything that we can to speed up that process of internal decline and fall. Not just, I mean, first and foremost for the safety of the entire world, and of course, first and foremost, Palestinians, but also for the people who live in Israel, who call themselves Israelis, who live in the most deranged society, certainly of the 21st century, and one of the most deranged human societies in all of human history. So our job is to focus on the pressure points, the nodal points that speed up that precipitate the internal decline of the state of Israel, which is already a process underway. It might take 30 years. It might take 100 years. I hope not. It might take 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, but it will happen. I'm very confident of that. So we know what some of those nodal points or pressure points are. You know, BDS is an obvious one, boycott, divestment, sanctions. Yeah. And of course, these are huge challenges for us. You know, I'm not saying these are easy things. The thing I talked about earlier with regards to the nature of British civil society being detached from trade unions and therefore detached from instrumental parts of the economy which really get the attention of power brokers, and Italy and Spain having that umbilical connection between civil society and unions, and therefore being able to bend the ear and twist the arm of the Maloney government even to send frigates onto the Mediterranean to protect us. We need to find a way in our countries. Our task is to carry on forging strategies that maximize the power of agents and infrastructures that have been created to support Palestine. And I'm confident that we can do that. I know it requires, particularly in this country, for example, a rewiring of economic relations to ensure that we're funneling that pro-Palestine stuff into unions and from unions into the state. But I'm confident we can do it. I'm confident that we can do it. By doing that in our respective localities, we then we help expedite the process of decline in Israel through BDS, through things like BDS, through isolation, cultural isolation, and so on, and all of the various forms of international solidarity that we can create, forge, develop to put maximum pressure on Israel to encourage it in its process of total isolation. Because I've been there very recently, as you know, and even though I didn't spend loads of time with Israelis, unsurprisingly, I saw that they are increasingly isolated. I've been there before because I've been there to see my family in Palestine. I had to go through Israel, and in order to do that, you don't run around saying, hey, I'm here to visit my Palestinian family. You go under the radar. And so people let their guard down and they show you more of themselves. I can see very clearly that Israel is like an island now in a way that it wasn't 10, 15 years ago. My dad, who lives there and had anti-Zionist Jewish friends in the 1970s and 80s when things were a bit different, says the same. Says they are full of fear and they are totally isolated apart from in relation to the United States. I don't think this is pie in the sky stuff. I wouldn't say it if I did. I try to be a hard-headed realist in my analysis of where we're going. And I think that's what we need to be focused on. In terms of accountability, okay, trust me, as soon as Israel collapses, as soon as that happens, all the rats will flee the ship. It's very possible, although I hope it's not the case, it's very possible that Trump will be long dead by the time Israel collapses. It's very possible that Netanyahu won't live to see the day that Israel collapses. It's very possible the entire Israeli political class that presided over this genocide will be gone. And there won't be that kind of accountability that we all so desperately yearn for and which the Palestinians so desperately deserve. Nonetheless, we need to focus on our task, which is, as I say, maximizing the inputs into the process that leads to Israel's, in my view, inevitable decline. And that will be the ultimate form of accountability. That will be the ultimate form of accountability.
I totally agree that we need to be focused on the material tasks ahead. And there's a lot that we can actually be doing here in Britain to go after the Zionist movement, the Israel lobby, and the Zionist regime's arms factories, and to cut the supply lines to the Zionist entity and to dismantle Zionism. That work has to continue, and we have to find what our roles are, our individual roles are in that process. But I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. So thank you very much, Kieran, for joining me.
It's been a heck of a ranging conversation, and I've really, really enjoyed it.
I've enjoyed it as well, and I'm sure our viewers will take a lot away from it. And of course, I want to thank our viewers as well. And if you like this content, please like, share, and subscribe. Help us to overcome the algorithmic limitations that we're facing. And we'll see you on the next one.